If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you're probably about to write your very first philosophy essay. Now, writing a philosophy essay can be a painful experience, but I'd rather it be a really rewarding process for you. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to be offering you some guidance that hopefully will help you as you go through this process. So I'm going to be basing this video off of a rubric that I often use for my business ethics and contemporary moral issues classes, but the advice I'm going to be giving should be pretty widely applicable to a wide variety of types of essays. So this video is going to be divided up into different sections, and I'm going to have timestamps in the description so that you'll be able to jump around based on what your needs are. Now, the first thing you need to keep in mind when you're setting out to accomplish any demanding task is that your set and setting are crucial. By set and setting, what I mean are your physical, mental, social, and environmental situation in which your activity is taking place. Paying attention to set and setting can mean the difference between a successful writing session and a really unsuccessful one. So before you get started, make sure that you've arranged your space in a way that works best for your body. I write best when I have two monitors. My primary monitor is for the document I'm typing, and my secondary monitor is for reference materials. You don't need to spend a lot of money on your external monitor, so I made mine by harvesting the screen from an old laptop and attaching it to a $15 controller board I bought from eBay. Make sure that your primary monitor is high enough for you to look at it without leaning forward. I bought a stainless steel stand to raise the height of my laptop. If you lean forward, most of the time while typing, you're going to have back and neck pain, and the quality and quantity of your work will be both diminished as you go on. Find a keyboard that works for you. So I've tried and tested all sorts of different ergonomic keyboards, and what works best for me is something called the Kinesis Freestyle 2. I like it because you can position the halves of it wherever you want. Find a mouse that works for you also, so I like trackball mice. Also invest in a good desk chair and make sure that it's adjusted so that it is comfortable for you, given how you are built. After ensuring that you have a good setup, take a minute to listen to your body. Are you hungry or thirsty? If so, drink some water or have a nutritious snack. I like apples for a light snack and peanut butter and apples if I want some protein. Are you tired? If so, what do you need to do to address that? For me, that sometimes means making a nice cup of coffee. Are you feeling restless? Figure out what you need to do to address that. For me, I like to do a lot of push-ups and go for a run. Do you need to use the bathroom? Do it. Are you holding tension in your breath? Breathe through it. Now, once your body is ready, listen to your mind. What are you feeling? What are you thinking? What tasks are buzzing around inside your head? Whatever is going on in there is okay. But your writing session is going to be more successful if you can let those thoughts pass through you like clouds across the sky instead of engaging with them. Mindfulness meditation and yoga are really helpful for that. In the meantime, here's a ritual that helps me. Write down all of your thoughts and worries on a piece of paper, then fold it up and put it in your pocket. Tell yourself that you have nothing to be afraid of by taking a break from those thoughts, and that you can return to them once your work is over. If you haven't already done so, turn your phone on silent and move it to a place where it won't disturb you. Set up your computer so that it too will not disturb you with notifications. One thing you might not realize is that every time you quickly check your email or social media accounts, you destroy your productivity for a while because of something called attention residue. Although you may try to put your focus back on your paper, you will not completely let go of the alternative task that you began while switching over to your email or social media accounts. Some of you probably have Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok open right now. Stop it. Put it away. Those kinds of weapons of mass distraction are addictive, and if you don't cultivate an ability to resist them now and engage in long periods of uninterrupted, focused work, your ability to produce greatness will be severely diminished. So the next step is to form an intention. Is your goal for this session to write an outline, to write a section of your paper, to write the whole paper, or something else? In this session, my intention is going to be to write an entire paper. How long will your writing session be? I'm going to be writing for an hour and a half. How will you structure your time? I'm going to spend 20 minutes writing, followed by 5-minute breaks. And during the breaks, I'm going to get out of my chair and stretch. Some philosophy teachers give undergraduate students no meaningful guidance at all on how to write their first philosophy essays. If your teacher falls into this category, schedule a meeting with them or talk with your TA to ask what they are looking for. Ask detailed questions about 1. The ways you will be graded, 2, what distinguished highly successful essays in the past versions of the assignment? And 3, what distinguished unsuccessful essays in the past? During that meeting, pitch a potential structure and change it depending on what feedback you receive. So this is the rubric that we're going to be looking at for the essay that we're talking about today. So you're going to be critically examining one criticism, that's one, not two, of When the Market Was Let's Private Government. So those are 2 chapters from Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, and Elizabeth Anderson's response to that criticism. Your paper must be 4 to 5 pages in length. That's not 45, but 4 to 5. Double-spaced, written in Times New Roman font, have 1-inch margins, be a .doc or .docx file, and follow the APA citation style. Your file name should be your last name, essay.file extension. So for example, if I did this, it would be Yarmel essay.doc. It's due by the end of the day on October 9th. After that, you're going to get feedback on it, and then you can revise it and resubmit it by October 30th, and you'll submit them to Canvas. So under How to Succeed, what I do is I give a brief overview of the different structural elements that your paper should have and the order that those elements should appear in your essay. So the first thing I'm recommending is that you read Jim Pryor's guidelines in writing a philosophy paper. So I have those pulled up here. If you haven't written a philosophy paper yet, this is an excellent series of ideas that you should take a look at. And I won't go through these in depth now, but I would recommend that you take a look at those at some point in the writing process, ideally before you start. Anyways, this is the structure that your paper should have. You're going to state a criticism that you'll be discussing and state whether you'll defend or reject it. So for example, one thing you could say is, Tyler Cowen argues that exit, when properly supplemented, is sufficient to protect the interests of workers. And so that's the criticism that you're going to be talking about. And then you could say whether you'll defend or reject it. So one thing you could say here is, I will reject it. Briefly explain your main reason for thinking that the criticism is true or false. So you could say here is, I reject this criticism. This criticism is false because when there aren't reasonable other alternatives, exit doesn't give workers a place to go. And then that's your introductory paragraph. Notice that in the introductory paragraph, we didn't say something like, from the dawn of time, people have thought about egalitarianism or anything fluffy like that. None of that. The only thing we want is just clearly you stating what you're going to be defending and briefly what your reason for that is. So you can state, here's the criticism, here's, am I going to defend or reject it, and here's a very brief explanation of why. So that's the first section of your paper. Second section of your paper, you're going to be presenting the criticism in detail. So again, just for the purposes of giving a clear example of this, we're going to focus on the criticism from Cowen that says that when properly supplemented by lots of other rights and other things that make exit less expensive, exit is sufficient to protect the interests of workers. So the first thing you're going to want to do is explain the part of Anderson's theory that is the target of this criticism. So clearly the part is the part in Private Government, the second chapter from her book, where she says that exit is not enough, and in fact you need voice. So you'd want to explain that there's these 4 different strategies. There's exit, there are constitutional rights, there's law, and then there's voice. And unless you have voice, the interests of workers are not going to be protected. So you do a couple paragraphs on that, maybe 2 paragraphs on that. And then you have to explain the criticism. So you can go and look at Cowen's paper. You can give a brief presentation of his criticism of that idea. So where he's defending exit. So that's section 2. Section 3, present Anderson's response to the criticism. So this is sort of like a, she said, and then he said. And now we're going to go on back to she said. So over in her final chapter of her book, Responses to Commentators, she gives a response to that criticism. So you're going to just say what she says. So what does she say? Well, she says something to the effect that even if supplemented with all the things that Cowen wants, exit will still only create an incentive for employers to keep the conditions just above what the nearest competitor has. And so really what it does is it gives the employer the ability to, lower the conditions of the workers and harvest the surplus. So go back and look at my lecture on that, and actually all these other things if you want fuller explanations of all of these ideas. I'm being kind of brief because I'm assuming that anybody watching this video has also seen my earlier lectures. All right, so we have she said, he said, she said. Now he gets to respond. Now, 4 is sort of a choose your own adventure. 4A12 and 4B12 are exactly the same. So I'm not going to distinguish between A and B until we get to 3. So let's start with 4.1. So imagine that now you are Tyler Cowen's representative. You've been hired by Cowen to represent him. Anderson has just given this response. He's just said that exit, even with these proper additions, isn't going to be sufficient. So you have to give a reply to Anderson on behalf of Cowen. So what could he say? Well, I think that if I were his representative, knowing his sorts of arguments that he makes, what I might tell him to say is, well, look, efficiency matters. And what Anderson is doing is going to result in lower efficiency. So we shouldn't give workers a voice. We should use exit, because if it's the case that we give them a voice and it leads to this really expensive, time-consuming process of them shaping company policies, that's going to hurt the efficiency of the firm. So that's what I might say in 4.1, whether we're in 4A1 or 4B1. Next thing you have to do is present a powerful response to the above reply. So you'd say, okay, Anderson, how do you respond to that? What I might tell her to say, knowing her stuff, knowing her arguments, would be to say, well, why don't you tell him that efficiency isn't the most important thing, and that if you're the sort of person who wants to weigh efficiency over the basic interests of workers, anytime those two things conflict, then what you're saying is that slight increases in profit, slight increases in share price can outweigh protecting the very basic interests of workers. And that's a huge problem. So that's what I would do for 4.1, 4.2, whether we're in A or B. Now, here's where we get to choose your own adventure. You have to figure out whether you think this response Anderson just gave succeeds. Now, I think it does, so I'm going to go with 4B3. But if I thought that it didn't, I would go to 4A3. And what I'll say here is that it's successful, and we have to give an explanation for that. There's lots of things you can do when we say give an explanation. You give an argument. I think the easiest thing to do at this point is to give an example. So the example I'll use is child slave labor in the supply chains of chocolate companies like Hershey, Nestle, Mars. And I think what that example shows is it gives like a really clear illustration that demonstrates that Anderson's response is the right one. It's abhorrent to say that these lives of children are worth less than or not their lives, but their interests and their conditions. That is just less significant than slightly increasing the share price of these large corporations. All right, so that takes us through 4. Now for 5, we'll give a very brief summary of what we've accomplished. So here you might write something like, Tyler Cowen criticized Anderson on these lines. I defended Anderson. I first presented her theory, then I presented his criticism, then I gave her response to it. I then considered a possible defense of his criticism, and then how Anderson might reply to it. Ultimately, I demonstrated that Anderson's reply was successful, and I gave an example that showed that. So that's 5. So that takes you through all the parts of the essay. Now, the other thing that this rubric shows is how you'll be scored. So you need to meet the requirements that I said above. That includes all these things. So your bibliography, the page length, everything. If you don't do that, you get an F. But if you do that, if you do include all those elements, here's how you'll be graded. So there's basically 3 components. There's organization, content, and writing. So for the organization, I want to make sure that when I'm reading this paper, I always know where I am in the paper. And one thing you can do is you can use informative section headings. So for example, one thing you could do is you could say, Section 1, Introduction. Now we know we're in the introduction. Section 2, Anderson versus Cowan. So here you could do is you could present the criticism and the response to Anderson. Sorry, the part of Anderson's paper and the criticism. Section 3, Anderson's response. Section 4, evaluating the response. So those could be some section headings that could be really helpful. And then Section 5, conclusion. And notice that you can have more than one paragraph per section. What you want to do with paragraphs is do no more than one thing per paragraph. Okay, so that's your organization. Content. I want to make sure that every step of your thought process is explicit. So show us what you're thinking. Show us how you're arguing. You got to present the criticism, present Anderson's response, and you have to have a good evaluation of the criticism, right? And then there's 3 parts to that. The reply to Anderson's response, the response to the reply, or the assessment of the response. If you leave out one of these things, you lose 10 points. And then what we're looking for when you do these, like when we're grading those, is did you make every step of the thought process explicit? Are you leaving things out? Okay. Originality. I want you to have at least one thing that isn't contained in the readings. And there's a couple of ways that could happen. So one thing you could do is in Section 4, when you present the powerful reply, you could make one up that isn't in the readings. Powerful response, you can make one of those up that isn't in the readings. But at the very least, the explanation here or here in 4b3 or 4a3, that could come from outside of the text. So the easiest way to do that is just going to be to give an example that comes from outside of the text. Writing. So it's really important that you are clear, concise, and precise. So when we talk about clarity, we're talking about using really simple language that makes the meaning of what you're saying very clear. I don't want any obscurantism. I don't want anything that is flowery. Don't try to impress me with your vocabulary. It will not work. The only thing I care about is whether you're giving, you're using the words that you need to use in order to clearly explain what your ideas are. Represent valid arguments, represent sound arguments. If you could do everything in like a 5th grade vocabulary, that's completely fine. So that's for clarity. Concision. Stay on topic, don't write fluff. I don't want stuff in this essay that doesn't immediately serve the needs of the essay. So no digressions. And precision. Be careful with word choice. Don't say true when you mean sound. Don't say sound when you mean valid, etc. All right, and that's how the essay will be graded. The next thing we need to do is look through the text and pull up the quotation that we will use in constructing the essay. We need the following quotations. Anderson's statement of the part of her theory that says that exit is insufficient to protect the basic interests of workers. That'll be for 2.A. Cowan's criticism of that part of her theory. That'll be 2.B. Anderson's response to Cowan's criticism, 3. Cowan's reply, 4.B.I. Anderson's response to Cowan's reply, 4.B.II. And any quotations necessary for explaining why the response from 4.B.II is successful, and that'll happen in 4.B.III. Now that we have a plan for writing the essay, and a list of quotations that we will use for the essay, we're ready to write it. So let's go implement the plan. So one of the most important questions you're going to have to ask yourself while you're writing your essay is as follows. What is the right balance between editing while you're writing and not editing while you're writing? You really need to find the Aristotelian mean between the vices of excess and deficiency. If you do an excessive amount of editing while you're writing, you're never going to get anything done because you're not going to be able to go through this process of just churning out a complete draft that you can then go back and edit later. If, on the other hand, you do a deficient amount of editing, you'll end up with a complete piece of garbage that doesn't look anything like the plan that you set out to implement. So you have to find the right balance. What you're noticing me do while you're seeing this at a fairly rapid speed is that sometimes I'm going back and I'm altering different sentences if I just know from experience that the way that I started a sentence isn't going to lead to a place where I'd like it to go. But for the most part, I'm not really changing any of the basic ideas that I'm talking about. And one of the reasons why I'm able to do this is because I already came up with a plan before I started to write. Another thing has to do with quotations. So you'll notice that in the step before I started writing, I made a document that had all the quotations that I was going to draw from while I was doing the actual writing. And what that allows me to do is to just kind of go between my quotation document on my secondary monitor and my primary monitor, which is where the document is, without having to go all the way back and look at the texts, right? So it's really important to come up with a plan ahead of time and to do the work ahead of time where you come up with this document with the quotations. At this point, I've moved on to part 3, where I'm talking about Anderson's response. And you can see, still I'm doing a little bit of self-editing, going back and changing some sentence structure and just the framing of the paragraphs. But what I have in mind is, I already know what I'm going to be doing in the paragraphs, and I'm not changing the basic ideas. Okay, so now we're in part 4. So with part 4, what you're going to have to do is figure out how you're going to express the idea that these aren't the author's responses, but this is how you think that they could respond. So what I chose to say was Cowan could respond to Anderson by saying. One thing that I remember noticing while I got to this part in the essay is that I don't always use the same language when I'm thinking about what is being protected by rights of exit and rights to voice, constitutional rights, other things like that. Sometimes I talk about fairness, other times I talk about basic interests. And so what's really important is that I made a mental note of this. I wasn't going to go all the way back through the essay and change it while I was writing, but my plan when I got to this point was to make a note of that so that when I went back into the editing process, when I go back and edit, I will be able to know that I need to work on that. I need to standardize my language so that every single argument is expressed using the same idea of what we're trying to protect, what types of rights and interests we're trying to protect. At this point, you can see me struggling to express exactly how to talk about the trade-offs between worker interests and shareholder value, and you saw the formulation that I arrived on. Anytime it takes me a while to come up with a formulation like that, I have the suspicion that I'm going to be going back and revisiting it during the editing process. But it was really important just to kind of get something down so that I'd have something on paper that I could go back and talk about later. Now, one of my least favorite things to do is to write conclusions. I hate doing that. I never liked doing it as a student. Still don't like doing it. And so the conclusion I wrote down there was quite provisional, with the understanding that I'll go back and I'll modify it during the editing process. And then you can see the introduction. I'm just talking about what I'm going to be doing throughout the course of the essay. And I'm very clear. There's no fluff. There's no since the dawn of time. It's just, here's what I'm going to be doing. Now I'm giving informative section headings. So section headings are really important for making sure that the reader knows where they are in your essay at all times. And here I am working on my works cited, and there I am putting it into the document. It's really important to do your works cited or else you're going to get an F on the essay. And there we are. So we're now done with our draft. In order to maximize your productivity, take a break between when you finish your first draft and when you edit it. If you step away from it for a few hours or even a day, you'll come back with fresh eyes and you'll be able to notice things you wouldn't have seen if you had jumped right into editing.